let's take a new look at culture to make sure we walk the walk.
This podcast is brought to you by ArchMed, fast and focused design and manufacturing.
I'm Greg Maurer, founder and owner of Archimед.
And I'm Caroline Squattrigo, talent engagement specialist. We are on a journey to grow, learn, and gain expertise in small to mid-size company culture. Join us.
So today we are going to take a look at company culture from a new angle. To start off, we're going to be joined with Mike Bensi. Mike is the founder of Bensi and Company, where he helps leaders and leadership teams create clarity and momentum on strategies and goals that move the organization forward. And Mike has also been involved with Archimed in the past, and he's always helped us out a lot. Later, we will speak with Dr. Josh Plaskoff. Josh spent many years in industry and currently teaches MBA classes on the human aspects of business, including leadership and organizational behavior.
Dr. Josh Plaskoff was a great addition to an earlier episode of our podcast, so I'm excited to have him back on, and have enjoyed working with Mike for years now. So let's get Mike on the show and hear what he has to say about the layers of culture in a real world example.
All right. Well, welcome, Mike, to the show. We're very excited to have you, and thank you for joining us today. So we are talking about the layers of culture, and one problem we've seen companies face is when not all of their layers line up. I know you've worked with a lot of companies throughout your career. Do you have a story you can share of a client where their layers of culture did not line up and there was a problem that resulted from this?
Yeah, you bet, you bet. And first, thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be on. And it is something that I hear quite often. I work with companies where they're in a moment, and maybe they don't use those words like, "Hey, our layers are off," right? But they are talking about like, "Gosh, something's just not working." And so, I remember, and this is many many years ago, but meeting a company and working with them, and it was great. At first, like you walk in, they had a beautiful new office. They had just renovated. They had new furniture. They had a nice break area for employees to enjoy. And then there was this, one piece, pretty simple. It was a ping pong table, and I didn't think much of it. I'm like, oh, that looks like fun. And but you looked at it, and it looked brand new, even though they had been in the new space for almost a year. And so the idea was, talking with the company, like, wow, this ping pong table, it's going to be great. We're going to have lots of fun with it. And they even pointed to a value on the wall, like, look, collaboration, right? This is a way to blow off steam. We'll have fun together, and we'll play. But it was this really interesting scenario where they worked really hard, and they were incentivized, in terms of based on individual performance. So a couple of things that they were discovering is that, one, because they did work so hard, anybody who tried to use that ping pong table, they were looked down upon, right? Like, how dare you have fun? How dare you play? We're trying to win at all costs, and ping pong tables are not for winners. The second was, they looked at those incentives, right? The behaviors in terms of what are we trying to incentivize, and they were incentivizing based on individual performance. How well did I do? How much could I sell? How much could I make? And they weren't doing anything around collaboration. So, the problem that they were having is that people weren't collaborating, right? And when you're frowning upon, socializing during work hours, and you're incentivizing based on individual performance, it was like a little aha for them, like, oh my gosh, right? We had never thought of that. And so, it was a sad story, but they're moving in the right direction. It's really hard because they have incentivized for so long on those behaviors, but they are trying different things to collaborate. Still can't get anybody to play ping pong with me, but we'll try some other time.
When you said, Mike, that ping pong is for losers, it reminded me of that Glenn Ross line.
Right.
I think it's Alec Baldwin says, coffee is for closers. And so, yeah, you talk about how the values and assumptions and behaviors aren't lining up in that instance. And so I guess they're left to either undertake the difficult task of encouraging people to collaborate without punishing them for slippage on the individual achievements,
Absolutely.
or you get rid of the ping pong table.
It's funny, they actually considered that. Like, should we just scrap it? And the reason why they didn't is because they really did want to create space for employees to blow off steam. They did work hard, right? They worked really hard. And they wanted to just find opportunities to create easy ways to socialize. So, unlike Alec Baldwin in that movie, what they did, they actually used the ping pong table to just create some forced social activities that were also competitive, but it had them working together as a team. So it was a really silly but small way to just allow the organization to say, hey, we can do this, we can work together. When you win together, you get rewarded together as well.
So in this instance, how did you get the leaders to see the misalignment?
Honestly, they could feel it. They just weren't putting it together. It wasn't like me going into the ping pong table and saying, "Hey, why aren't we playing with this?" Right? They were seeing it in terms of why are we having the same issues? These are the same issues around why people aren't working together, nobody's talking. They knew something was up. What I simply did was just, I think they would say, just kind of ask the right questions to point to what behaviors they actually wanted to occur. I think they kept saying they wanted collaboration, but until we actually drilled down deep into it and had them almost force them to explain what collaboration meant, that's when they finally were able to make some changes and realize what changes needed to be made around that.
Well, thanks, Mike. That was an awesome story, and it's always good to understand how these issues show up in the real world. I think it helps provide a lot of context, and certainly this idea is kind of a complicated one, so I appreciate you bringing us in on that.
No, I appreciate you having me. Thanks so much for asking.
Thanks, Mike. Caroline, let's get some advice from Dr. Josh Plaskoff on the 3 layers of company culture. We'll dig in a little bit deeper here. Okay, Dr. Josh Plaskoff has served in a variety of employee experience and human resource positions in companies including Emmis Communications, ExactTarget, and Anthem, and currently teaches classes on the human aspects of business at the Kelley School of Business at IU and Western Governors University. Great to have you, Josh.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. It's great to be here.
Well, Josh, welcome. I've heard a lot about you. I've read a little bit, but can you just give us a little background on your work experience and how that shaped your view on company culture?
Wow, it's a long journey. I actually was trying to figure out what I wanted to do back in college, and combine science and humanities, and never really could kind of figure out how it all worked. I ended up going in the computer field in the '80s, and just felt like something was missing. I've always loved learning, and I think learning is sort of the core of culture work. And I realized that after I was working in several organizations and spent time and thought more about how do we create organizations that allow people to learn better, because I see learning as kind of the core of what makes us human. And I saw that there weren't a lot of people working on that, and kind of assuming that learning is just a thing we do. And it is independent of the organization. So I actually dove into it and fell into it. And as I worked through organizations, I realized more and more that there were ways of combining the idea of the idea of culture and the idea of being human beings together in the same place, and that those did lead to organizational effectiveness and to results. And so it's been about a 20, 25, 30-year journey of putting together pieces from all parts of my life to work on culture and work on changing organizations to become more human.
Well, that's perfect because I want organizational effectiveness and results. So
Don't we all?
what you that's what I want. That's what I'm looking for. So today we're going to talk about these layers of company culture to see if we can understand a sort of a different perspective or different way of looking at company culture. There's so many different ways to look at company
Mhm.
culture, and that's an interesting aspect of the topic, but it's also a challenge.
Mhm.
For someone like me, I'm trying to find the lens and then stick with the lens and look through it. But there's so many different lenses, so I'm excited to hear about this one. So, what are the three layers of company culture?
Yeah, actually, before I dive into that, I think you said something that's important, which is the idea of lenses. And, you know, culture is very complex. And I think sometimes what we do is we oversimplify it. We think, oh, we just go into a workshop that some consultant has, and all of a sudden, magically, we have culture. And I think it's much more complex than that. And I think breaking it down into layers and components helps somewhat, but we have to think about it in the larger sphere of things. So, let's kind of, before we get to the layers, let's kind of think about, culture is really sort of a carved out area of meaning that we create from an infinite amount of meaning. I mean, think about that. Meaning is infinite. We can create any kind of meaning that we want out of this world as groups of people and as individuals. And what we do to try to make sense of things is we carve out a little piece of it to say this is what our idea of meaning is. And even within organizations, there are subgroups that carve out their idea of meaning. And so, when you've got that level of scale and complexity, it's sort of hard to try and understand. And so I like to look at these layers as sort of helping us understand sort of the dynamics of what's going on with culture. So let's look at these layers and think about it almost like an onion. I actually took this from work by a professor named Edgar Schein, who is at MIT. I think he's retired now. And I really like this idea of layers. So the first layer, if we look at it, are called the artifacts. And we think about artifacts. Artifacts are things that we make as human beings. And there are a variety of different kinds of artifacts. There is language, that's an artifact. There are the rituals that we have in organizations, like the Friday coffee clatch, or the stand-up meetings. There are the ceremonies that we have. So the 10-year anniversary meetings, there's the physical space that we create for ourselves that tells us things. Those artifacts, if you think about it, this is kind of uh, applicable to what's going on now in terms of viruses. We're so into the viruses and everything that's going on. These are the carriers of meaning. These are the viral spread of meaning of these artifacts, because embedded in them are what we find meaningful. And so if you think about it, and I'll give you some examples, if you're in a workplace that is closed off, everyone has offices that have doors, and people stay in those offices, what it's conveying in terms of meaning is that we think that individuals need to work separately. While if you're in an open space where people are constantly knocking into each other and banging into each other, then what we're really conveying is that we want people to connect. We think that work is about connecting and hitting each other. So these artifacts are what we use to create our meaning. And those artifacts um, uh, convey values. Now, that's the second layer. The second layer is values. Now, values are pretty complex. They're really what we believe to be valuable to us. Now, we've all had value statements and things like that in organizations, and you put them on the wall, and here are our 5 values and all of that. They're really two different types of values. There are values that we espouse, which we say these are our values, and we put them out there. But those aren't necessarily the values that our artifacts show or that we really believe. Those are the artifacts we want to believe, maybe, but not necessarily the values that we do believe. So there are these enacted values that really are the true values by which we operate. And sometimes they match up with the artifacts. What we say is our values. Sometimes they match up with those artifacts. And sometimes our artifacts tell us something completely different about what our values are. So, for example, we may say, oh, we want to be a team organization, and we create all the mugs and t-shirts of team, 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 and the hashtag team and blah, blah, and all that kind of stuff. But if you really look at the values sometimes about what really is happening in terms of our behaviors and the deep artifacts, the complex artifacts, like how we talk with each other, how we act, and the relationships we have with each other, the real value may be more on individual achievement. And so, that leads to some conflict because people hear one thing, but they see another thing in terms of the more of the artifacts show about individual achievement than they do about team achievement. So while you say teams are important, you're actually doing the opposite. So that second layer is the values. Now the values are informed by something that's really complex called the hidden assumptions. Like I said, we carve out our idea of meaning in an organization. And our meaning in an organization is informed by our assumptions about the world, about what it means to be a human being, about time, about people. Are they generally good? Are they generally not good? Do we think more short term? Do we think more long term? What's more important to us? And what's challenging about that is that there's an old saying that the fish can't see the water it swims in. Have you ever heard that statement? The fish
Oh
can't.
yeah, sure.
It applies to culture because these are things that we don't really consider. They just kind of taken for granted. And we don't think about them. But what they do is those hidden assumptions inform everything that we do in terms of the culture. Now, what's challenging for us is how do you actually question things like that? Because it's hard to see. And it also can be kind of painful because you may realize that you're believing things that you really don't want to believe, that are difficult for the organization. And you have to kind of challenge some really deeply held assumptions about things that are informing your artifacts. So those are the three layers. And what we need to do is understand how all those layers fit together so that there's integrity, so that what we believe in terms of our assumptions feed into our values, which then are reflected in our artifacts. And that's why this is so challenging, because that kind of alignment is really, really difficult. You're dealing with things that you don't really have a lot of consciousness of. You're dealing with artifacts that are generated on a daily basis. I mean, even the way we use words. So, we tend to use in United States and actually Western civilization, we use a lot of have words, possession words. I have a headache, have a toothache. Back in Renaissance days, they didn't say that. Do you know what they said?
Toothache have?
My
No,
yeah. No, my tooth hurts. My head hurts.
My
It's more a
tooth hurts.
state of being than it is a possession.
State
You know,
of being.
It's
Yeah.
it's how they are rather than what they have. We're so into having that so much of our language is about having. Now, I'll here's an interesting thing. So I'll harken back to Hebrew, see if you know any of this Hebrew. Do you know how to say I have in Hebrew?
Yeshli.
Yeshli, which means it is to me. So in ancient times, we didn't own anything. We stewarded it. So there's no way to say I have in Hebrew because we didn't have. Nobody had. It was assumed that the big one upstairs had. And so our language is, if we think that way, it is to me. I'm stewarding it, but I don't actually have it. So even our deep language tells us things about what we believe and what we think in terms of our culture. So when you think about analyzing culture, looking at your culture, you have to look at all three of those. You have to look simultaneously. So you have to look at the artifacts. What are the artifacts saying? Are they saying that we're team based, or are they saying that we're more individual based? And you have to question them and look deeply into them and find out what's it really saying. What meaning is it spreading around to the organization? And then you look at your values and say, okay, are the values we're saying aligned with those artifacts? And also, do they represent the assumptions that we truly want to believe or that we do believe? And if they don't, how do we then make more of that alignment? The other thing that's challenging too is that there's no single culture in any organization. There are multiple cultures. And we want diversity. We want diversity of thinking. So it's not about making what I call Stepford employees. Everyone's the same, everyone believes the same, because everyone has a different view of what things are. And that's
Mm-hmm.
the nice thing about being human beings, is that we all have different views. And how do we bring those together so that everyone feels like they're part of it, but at the same time they can be themselves? They can bring what they think to the table. So it's complex and it's difficult.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I think people stumble, is they make it too simple. Oh, all we have to do is change this and we're done. No, it's not that simple.
Yeah. There's this cartoon I took a screenshot of and I sort of keep around, and it's got these two lines of people. There's one person in one line,
Uh-huh.
and there's 100 people in another line, and there's a sign above each line. And on the hundreds people, it says answers, simple but wrong. And on the other side, it says answers, complex but right. And there's only one guy in that line, that complex line.
Greg, I think you're
Yeah.
that guy, knowing you.
Yeah.
But no, Josh, thank you for, really diving into that for us. It, like you said, it is super complex. I don't want to go against what you just said, but in order to boil it down a little bit, so
Yeah.
it sounds like, artifacts are what you say. Values are kind of what you're doing or the actions you're taking, hopefully that align with what you're saying. And then I think hidden assumptions, it sounds like, is where it gets really complex. And it makes me think of like the idea of trust, like a company assuming I trust the employees, or we run up against it a lot with new employees where we can tell they don't trust us yet, and we kind of have to earn that. And I wonder if that kind of plays into the hidden assumptions layer.
Yeah, actually, let me correct a little thing, because the artifacts isn't just what you say, it's also what you do.
Oh, it is what you do. Okay.
Yeah, the values are really what you believe.
Okay.
Expressed what you believe. The hidden assumptions are what is your view of reality that informs those values.
Okay.
So yes, trust. If you think about it, underneath trust is, so let's use as employees as examples. If we have a hidden assumption that employees are generally lazy and they don't want to do work and they're really up for themselves, which actually is a very common view if you think about it in organizations. A lot of leadership and management will be very authoritarian. They'll be very prescriptive. They'll watch people. They won't trust the employees to do stuff. And that's not saying that they're bad people. It's just that those assumptions that are hidden underneath cause that. Now, if we assume that employees in general are good, nice people, they want to achieve, they want to contribute, they want to take on responsibility, then leadership will probably have more trust and say, let's let them do what they do. Let's let them decide how to do their work. And we think about it in terms of COVID, returning to office. A lot of companies are now doing return to office. Do we allow the employees to determine when they want to come back and how often they want to come back, or do we prescribe for them when they should come back? So underneath that is some trust. There is a trust element to it, but it's really informed again by our beliefs about human beings and about our relationships and about what we think about reality. And that determines how we trust each other as well, as part of a culture. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think I was thinking it's almost like they all feed into each other at once. I feel like I was trying to make it more linear, and it's more like cyclical, or like it's all just
Yeah,
like a
circle.
ball of like.
And this is also why this is challenging, because a lot of our civilization is moving toward what I'm calling left brain, which is a simplification, but the idea that things are logical and analytical and linear and measurable and all of that. But really, there's this right brain, which is holistic and somewhat non-rational and at times complexly interrelated and web-like. And culture is more like that. And what we a lot of times try to do is force it into a linear, measurable, quantitative, sequential model, and it's not. It's not. And most of human life, actually, if you think about it, is not linear and logical. We're not very logical. We're, I once had an economist tell me that organizations are rational, logical, um, um, profit-making machines, and it's like, no, there's a lot of non-rational. That doesn't mean wrong. It just means that it's not everything is makes complete, perfect, logical sense as human beings. We're
Well,
not.
yeah, I mean, they're run by humans, so
Yeah, human beings are
it's
complex.
gonna happen.
That's what makes us nice, you know. So yeah, that's the challenge too of working with culture is you have to think in such a different way because that we can do, but we've sort of dismissed it. Thinking more holistically and relation. Like think about like the web. The web is not a linear program anymore. It's this interlocking of all of these pieces that you can bounce around all over the place. And culture is kind of the same way, and dealing with culture and relationships is the same way.
I was thinking about the hidden assumptions, and
Hmm.
and I don't like the idea of being steered by these hidden assumptions. I'd like to shine some light on those assumptions.
Hmm.
Are there a certain set of questions that you could ask yourself as leaders and owners of a company that philosophically how you view things, and then you'd sort of get those assumptions out in the open. Do you trust your employees? Questions like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and that I think part of it comes down to having those good conversations and deep, honest conversations. Do we believe that our employees um, are good people in general and have the company's best interests at heart, or do we think that maybe that we don't trust them and that and that's not saying that again that people are bad. It's just that sometimes we don't even know that we're doing things, and that's what's hard is asking questions and then really facing up to it based on evidence that we see. So when was the last time, for example, when was the last time that we um, really let go of control and allowed our employees to make decisions, complex decisions that really influence the company? If you say never, then you probably should look and say, you know what, maybe we don't trust our employees a lot. Maybe we need to trust them a little bit more, or trust that they have the company's best interests, or the organizations, or each other's, or whatever. So part of it is challenging through the behaviors and the actions that have been taken. What are we saying? It's almost reverse engineering it, saying what, based on these actions that we've taken, what is it saying, as opposed to moving the other direction.
Hmm.
What are we saying to our employees, or to ourselves, or to our company, or to our customers, or whatever, based on the actions that we've done, and really standing back from that and analyzing it and saying, looking from the outside, what are we saying? um,
This is an interesting um, discussion. We're going to at some point in this year uh, get our leadership group together
mhm.
for a day long retreat, and we're developing topics and things like that. And I think it would be fun to have just a conversation about getting a set of questions together and
Yeah,
asking the leadership to answer them together to see if we can align ourselves on some of that stuff. Here's
yeah,
a practical question. So
yeah.
there is an artifact at our offices,
Hmm.
closed doors, no windows. Um, they exist because when we bought the building, those offices existed.
Hmm.
And so I don't think that represents our espoused value of collaboration and teamwork.
Hmm.
The question is how much is that worth, to remodel? I mean, is it if it's $10,000 we should do it, 5,000, to put windows in, how much is it worth to take an artifact and change it so that it reflects your value?
That there are kind of two, I guess, different schools of thought for that. There are a lot of people that spend lots and lots of money on fashioning their building to what, or their workspace to what they think it should be. Um, Another is to just spend time having a conversation about it and say, um, it really doesn't reflect our values, but you know what? Let's find other ways to do it despite that.
Hmm.
So you can influence culture. I mean, I've once said, give me 10 people in a garage and I can probably make them more interactive and more of a really dynamic collaborative culture than some of these fancy buildings with all of these collaborative spaces and all this complex stuff, because it's more about the relationships that you forge and the understandings you forge with each other. So what you don't want to do is fall into a trap where it's every single artifact needs to reflect it, and we need to spend all this money and change all this stuff, so much as maybe even just recognizing and having conversations about it, or seeing if it is influencing anybody. Sometimes people say, nah, that really doesn't bother us. What bothers us more is that we're not getting together on a regular basis. Okay, well then let's get together on a regular basis and not worry about the windows. um, but it is something to consider, particularly if you're a brand new organization. A lot of times what you can do is put some of those things in place early in an organization's history to start reflecting that early. So, I don't necessarily recommend to people going out spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to remodel their buildings, because now it'll show the culture, so much as
Right.
spending more time talking and trying to decide together, negotiating meaning together. What does it mean for us to be collaborative? What does it mean to us? What do we want to see? Irrespective of what the place looks like and all that. That's just one artifact. If you've got 90 other artifacts that are really showing collaborative, dynamic stuff, and everyone really finds meaning in that, the windows won't matter. They'll
So,
disappear.
so
You know?
rituals, are rituals artifacts?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, we have, I think, a number of interesting rituals. One of them is brand new, our lunch program, where Caroline randomly pairs people,
Uh-huh.
groups of four, to go out and have lunch together from different departments and people who don't necessarily interact with each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another one is our dartboard,
Uh-huh.
on the floor. So you see a lot of people, instead of sitting down at a conference table to hash out an issue, they'll throw darts as they talk through something.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So I I feel like, I like a lot of our artifacts, and they haven't been thoughtful. We didn't choose the dartboard because we said, we want people to interact. It's sort of naturally
Yeah.
the who we are.
Yeah. And that's a lot
Um,
of times how culture happens. It's organic and it just appears. People just pop up. I worked for a software company, and I was at their office in Chicago, and at 5 o'clock, all of a sudden, this person stood up and ran around the office, giving people high fives, and then went back to the desk and started working again. And
every day.
and and then the next day, somebody else did,
Wow.
and it was like, what is going on here? And then I realized this is a ritual they have. It's sort of like end of the day. We all did great work. We're starting the new phase, which is after 5 for the people who stay later.
Uh-huh.
And that's their separation time. That's their kind of signal that we're now in a new phase. And it worked for them. It's something that was meaningful for them. So, a lot of times people force cultural rituals and things like that. A lot of times they just pop up because they're meaningful to people and they create them. And you have to allow that, popping up of rituals. And then you kind of say, well, why are people doing this? What does it mean to us? What does the dartboard mean? Part of it may be having fun, you know. Part of it may be accuracy, of thinking about how do we hit the target? How do we, maybe there's some symbolism in it of, how do we keep
Hmm.
track? How do we keep targeted, in a fun way? There's always meaning behind it. It's kind of like, reading a poem, or I mean, back in, high school English, where you'd read a poem and try and find the meanings of all that stuff. That's what culture is we're a text. And what is our text telling about us? What is it saying about us?
I never did well in
Yeah,
that section of English class. It was
it's tough.
always hard time finding the meaning of a
It's tough.
poem.
Yeah.
So, how do we know like if our layers are not aligned? Is it a feeling, or are there questions we should like actively be asking ourselves? Or to Greg's point, when we go on this, leadership retreat, is it
Hmm.
should we have some agenda to say like let's break this down and make sure we're aligning here? Or is it, red flags are being raised across the company because, people can feel it? How do we know?
I think it's all of those. I think you use as much evidence as you can to understand where things may be misaligned. It could be that people are acting a certain way that you really don't think that culture should be, and then you say, why? What is doing that? And or it could be that there's something very obvious, that we're saying this, but you know what, this thing is not showing it. I mean, it's just obvious, and we need to address that. Sometimes they are more hidden, and you have to really dive down deeply. I'll give you an example, a real example from an organization. There was an organization that was very, very, interested in being team oriented, and this organization had what was essentially an open database of people who got promotions, and it gave their bio and a picture, and it was giving them kudos, for their promotion, and it was open to all the employees, so all the employees had access to it. And I decided to do a little experiment, and I went into the employee or the promotion database to find out how many of the statements that they made about the people mentioned anything about teams, that they started a team, they were a great team leader. What they really wanted was a team-based organization. And I read through, I don't know how many, 30, 50, 100, I don't even remember. Not one mentioned teams. They all mentioned their individual achievement. And so here you have this organization and the leader saying, we want teams, teams, but the promotion database is saying everything is about individuals. And when people read that promotion database, which they did because they wanted to find out, how do I get there? Or why did that person get there? They heard individual. So basically, all of this effort to create team was being hijacked by the real way that it was operating. People wanted to get promoted. Well, they're not going to listen to teams if the promotion database is saying this person got promoted because of their individual achievement. They're just not going to do it. They're going to follow the pathway that makes sense, that's going to lead to some kind of result. And being a team is not going to do that in this particular case. So that was a really interesting hidden gem of, so what could you do to change that? What do you think? I mean, how do you change the artifact to match the value?
So in that instance, you'd have to bring it to light. That's the first step. That's why you get this assumption, right? The hidden assumption is we value the individual's achievement.
Mm-hmm.
That's what counts.
Yeah.
And then to shine light on that so that the leadership says, wow, my espoused value is teamwork, and my enacted value is in individual achievement, and that's a misalignment.
Yep.
So one or the other will change.
Yep.
And if they're idealists, they'll change the way they view individual achievement and focus on teamwork.
Mm-hmm.
If they're cold-hearted, maybe they'll stop saying they value teamwork. What did they do?
Or not necessarily cold-hearted, but just not able to really change it because they don't accept it. And it's, again, it's not about good people and bad people. It's
right. I was too judgmental. I agree.
It's very hard to change this. But if you get that recognition, there's a simple tool. I mean, you look at it and you say, all we have to do is put a few sentences in there about how this person was a great team person. It's a freebie. It doesn't cost anything. It's nothing.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, you're communicating to people what our real value is, that we're promoting these people because they are living this value that we think is important. It's a freebie. Yeah. So, uncovering these things can be difficult, but you think about all the ways that you can communicate, the tools that are out there, the artifacts that are representing, which are going to reach the people most, which are the most powerful because they're related to things like promotions, like recognition, like feeling of significance and importance. Those are what people really want to hear on the job. They want to hear that they're important. They want to know that they have some kind of future, or, they want to know that they have some autonomy, that they can grow, they can learn. Those are the things that are most important. So how do you link it to those things that people really think are important? That's how you can kind of say which are the things that people look at or people are looking at. Now, sometimes people will just tell you, and you can encourage the organization to say, hey, we want to be more teams. If you see anything that's out of alignment, you let us know.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk, and sometimes employees will, very sensitive and astute employees will be able to recognize those and communicate it and say, you say this, but look what's happening. For that, you do need to create a sense of trust,
So,
that people will be listened to.
to say that we're interested in all this is an understatement. I absolutely want our espoused values to line up with our enacted values,
Yeah.
and I want our artifacts
Yeah.
to reflect our values.
Yeah.
And so, is there we talked about different tools to it's basically we need to do some sort of audit of all of this.
Yeah.
The hidden stuff, the take the blinders off, hard look in the mirror. Are there specific tools? Is there a specific list of questions? Is there a specific process to go through?
Yeah, actually, I created one for an organization, see the water it swims in, and if you have an outside person that can look at it sort of from a distance and say, here's some interesting things I've seen, they can help with surfacing some of these things. But some of the things you have to do is explore some of the artifacts that people are find near and dear. So collecting stories, I call them hero stories and villain stories. Stories are great ways of understanding the values of the organization and the what's true about the organization, because the hero stories, oh, remember Bill, that great salesperson, and he did this, and it lives for 10 years in the organization about Bill, even though Bill left the organization 5 years ago. They're still telling stories about Bill. That kind of story tells you about what's valued, because heroes are what people value. Villains are, oh, you remember, Jim? Oh gosh, Jim was a mess, blah blah blah. The villain stories are, this is what we don't want. This is the taboo in the organization. So collecting stories, looking at rituals that are not only formal rituals that are sanctioned by the organization, but rituals that people just do. Because a lot of times, like I said, they surface not necessarily from the top of the organization, they're just built into the fabric underneath the organization. People just do it. And watching for those things and examining those stories and those artifacts and the things that are sitting on people's desks, the language that people use, the common words that they use. If people are using a lot of military language, that says one thing versus people using more kind of collective caring language. Just the words that people use, the ones that are used most often, can tell you things about an organization. So you start collecting those things, and then you start making hypotheses about, what is this saying about our organization? What is this saying about our values? What is this saying about what we believe in? And then you can compare it with, what do we want it to be? Is this close, or are we missing the boat in some ways? And then now, how can we alter some of those artifacts? How can we add to new artifacts? How can we encourage and communicate to people what we're really trying to do here and get them involved with it and try and make it resonate with them and make it exciting for them and get them as part of the process? So yeah, there is, I mean, it's a fairly complex process, and that's why people want the simple pill. They want the simple silver bullet. What's going to fix my culture,
Right.
And it's not simple, because if you think about like psychotherapy, it's the same thing. Oh, I just want to go to fix this one problem in my life, and it takes you 10 years working with a psychotherapist to figure out that one thing, because it's your whole history. It's who you are. So you do it a little bit at a time.
I like the idea that we can, take a little bit of a hold on our company culture by taking a look at our assumptions and
Yeah.
doing an audit and having a discussion, because one of the challenges is always that culture sort of envelops, it's organic, and you can't really line it up and design it perfectly, and so this has been a really helpful discussion about viewing it in a certain light, and then having these open discussions about it, and maybe checking yourself along the way. Are we where we want to be, and if not, what can we do, like you said, to
Right.
add to the description of promotions, or to create another artifact. So this has been fascinating. I really appreciate your time,
Oh, sure.
Josh, to take us through these layers of culture. And if there are links that you think our listeners would be interested in, we can post those links to additional information where our podcasts
Yeah, I can do
are
that.
viewed.
Yeah. I think
Great.
the thing to remember is it is a slow organic process. It's not something you just engineer. It's
Hmm.
something you grow and nurture. So
Yep. You're
if you
right.
think
You're
about
right
it
about
that
that.
way and you're patient, you'll do much better than if you say in 3 months we want to change our culture to something else. It generally
Right. And I'm wired in the 3 month. I'm wired that way.
most of us are. Most of us,
Yeah.
you know.
Right. This is just a challenge.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
slow down and respect the organic process.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wonderful to have you on. Thanks a lot.
Thank
We had
you,
a lot
Greg.
of fun.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great talking with. Thank you.